context.
Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today to our Women's Earth and Climate Action Network press conference. I'm here in California right now, and we've been experiencing a lot of deadly fires these past months, and the devastating impacts of climate change we know are escalating worldwide. And in this urgent context, in fact, it is an existential crossroads for humanity and species around the world. I think one of the most important untold stories of climate change is how women are central to solutions. For me, this is the time of women rising up for the Earth and future generations. From the Amazon to Alaska, from India to the Marshall Islands, women are advocating, they're leading movements and rising up for climate justice. And we're gathering at this vital moment during the Global Climate Action Summit to have women's leadership, their solutions and demands be heard while elected officials are meeting in San Francisco. We're going to be demonstrating our community-led solutions for a just transition off of fossil fuels to a clean and regenerative energy. And we're also going to be calling out false solutions that don't respect social and ecological justice. We are showing what women from different parts of the world can do to accelerate our collective efforts to halt climate change, stop extractivism, and protect our lands, our water, and our children's future. Women are making a significant difference in changing our current trajectory. And I think a central message we want you all to have is that there's really not going to be any effective action on climate change until women's leadership is at the forefront. Studies around the world really demonstrate that while women are the most adversely impacted by climate change and environmental degradation due to gender inequity that impacts their economics, their voice, their mobility, their power to govern, and so much more, at the same time, they're indispensable to solutions. Around the world, we see that women land defenders are increasingly being criminalized and attacked and murdered. And I think we can't ignore the link between violence against women and violence perpetuated against the earth through exploitation and extractivism. And this violence exposes itself in terrible abuses that come from unchecked patriarchal societies, colonization, racism, and capitalism. And those things are all linked together. All of them are based on the same systems and ideologies that promote power over and exploitation of women, people of color, Indigenous people, and the land. So we're looking at these connections. And it's clear that if we're going to move towards climate justice and caring for the earth and our communities, we need to address these systems of oppression. And that's why we see women, amazing women, which you're going to hear from now and at our event, grassroots women connecting all of these issues together and working together. Many of the women that WECAN works with around the world, they always say to us, you know, we're not victims, even though we're hit first and worst, we're the solution. And they're absolutely right. Women are advocating for and implementing models of collective ownership of their seeds, their plants, their forests, and they're working to localize their economies. Women are modeling small-scale solutions with large impacts, and that often gets overlooked, that these small-scale solutions actually add up to big changes. We see that when women are empowered and given agency, there's critical benefits from sustainable local economies, population stabilizing, children's education improving. And in many countries, women vote more often than men, and when they're elected to public office, they lead on environmental and social legislation. In the Global South, 40 to 80% of all household food production is carried out by women. So when we're talking about food security and food sovereignty, which is critical right now, we're talking about women. This is also true. Many UN studies show that if you're talking about water issues and water programs, you have to engage the women because they have the local water knowledge and they have to be at the decision-making table. When we look at the global north, in the United States as an example, 70 to 80% of all household consumer purchases are decided by women. So when we look towards leveraging democratized, decentralized, renewable energy forces, we have to look towards the women. So in short, to address climate change, we need a transformative revolution based on social and ecological justice. And for this, we absolutely have to have women at the table and leading and looking at their solutions. WECAN will be hosting a full-day forum on September 11th in San Francisco on the eve of the GCAS, and it's going to be called the Women's Assembly for Climate Justice, and we invite everyone to attend. All the women here are going to be speaking at that event, sharing stories. There's going to be the president of the Marshall Islands with us, grassroots leaders from around the world, It's going to be a very powerful event, and I really encourage people to understand that this is a central issue, and we invite you to attend. And I want to just thank the speakers for taking time to be with us today, and all of you for listening in. Thank you.
Thanks, Osprey. Next up, we have Eriel Deranger of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation in Alberta, Canada, and Indigenous Climate Action.
Iklanate, dene sotlane Eriel Hussain, Deranger Betsy Ani Hasli. My name is Eriel Deranger, and I'm a member of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, and I'm the co-founder and executive director of Indigenous Climate Action. And I just want to thank Osprey and all of the organizers at WECAN for putting together this really important press conference and for the events that are happening in relation to the GCAS in the coming week. It's really imperative that we understand the connectivity of our struggles, not just as women, but as people. And right now, I come from a territory that's located in northern Canada, Treaty 8 territory, and it's downstream from one of the largest industrial projects on planet Earth, the Alberta tar sands. The tar sands is one of Canada's largest single emitters for greenhouse gas emissions, and it's continuing to grow unabated regardless of the commitments being put forth by the Canadian government and by the international community to take action on climate change. What we're seeing is instead of moving the bar away from these dirty industries, we're moving to actually continue to expand and exploit them further. Just recently, Canada approved the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which would carry over 900,000 barrels of tar sands oil from my people's territory to the coast of British Columbia, which would then be put into tankers, which would be transported down to the coast to California, outside of San Francisco in the community of Richmond. So when we talk about direct connections from my community to communities in California, we can see those very, very clearly in the exploitation and the destruction to safe waterways, to safe, healthy environments for our communities, and our rights are being destroyed and abrogated every single day. For you to understand why tar sands are so bad is that right now tar sands uses about 2 to 4 barrels of fresh water to produce oil. It's using natural gas to extract the oil from the ground, and it's creating massive lakes of toxic contaminant that are leaching and destroying our river systems. What this has also done to our communities, and you'll hear from others, is that these projects are also contributing to the degradation of the life of women in our communities with the imposition of man camps that are growing to the thousands. In northern Alberta, outside of Fort McMurray, we have 90,000 workers living in man camps that come into our territory, which has also included increasing in sex trafficking, increase of sexual abuse and domestic violence, increase of drugs and drug trafficking, and creating really safe environments, not only for women, but for our children. We have to think about how when we perpetuate the exploitation and destruction of Mother Earth, we're also sanctioning the destruction and violence against women, and it's so prevalent in my own community. And so when I go down to the GCAS today, next week, I want to see commitments come out that aren't just invested in capitalist systems, that aren't just invested in economic systems, but in human rights and women's rights, and the rights of Indigenous peoples need to be at the table and included to ensure that we have a safe, healthy environment for future generations. Thank you. Masicho.
Thank you, Eriel. Next, we have Thilmeeza Hussain, former Maldives Deputy Ambassador to the UN and also with Voice of Women. Welcome.
Assalamu alaikum. Argun minamiki Thilmeeza. Voice of Women ke faratu. My name is Thilmeeza, and I am talking to you today on behalf of Voice of Women. Currently, I'm working on a project to promote civic space in the Maldives in a very repressive environment in relation to the upcoming presidential election, which is happening on 23rd of this month. You may think, what is the relationship to environment and climate change and a presidential election or working to promote, to create more civic space? For us, it matters a lot because we had an autocratic government for the past 5 years since the first the government was overthrown by a coup. The new regime has rolled back on many of the environmental policies and acts with total impunity and disregard to not only just the environment, but also to women and women's rights. Maldives is a small country and an island nation and one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. And our president for the past 5 years have not attended a single environmental conference and had our voice heard or represented us, which is very disturbing and alarming. And we don't know how to move forward without having our voice heard and without us being represented in these important international forums. And referring to organizing and eventing, I cannot stress the importance of people organizing and rising and demanding governments do what we want them to do, rising to bring down these oppressive governments. We have seen firsthand what kind of change it can bring if people rise and demand and bring down these oppressive governments and stand up for their rights. We need to move forward, move fast to bring a climate revolution, to bring down these oppressive regimes and champion environmental issues. So countries like ours, like the Maldives, and the citizens of countries like Maldives don't have to be climate refugees. And we need to urgently address climate change. And I hope this global conference in the conference in San Francisco would take this revolution to a next level, and we will keep moving forward and moving forward faster to put pressure on governments all around the world, not just nationally here in the US. Thank you.
Thank you, Thilmeeza. Next, we have Kandi White from the Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara Nation and the Extreme Energy and Just Transition Campaign and the Indigenous Environmental Network. Welcome.
Thank you. Dosha Mariguets, Marishima Ishuia Hets. And so in my Hidatsa language, I said, hello relatives, my name is Eagle Woman. My English name is Kandi White, and I am a Mandan Hidatsa Arikara woman from North Dakota. And I just wanted to really point out that this Global Climate Action Summit that has been called by Governor Jerry Brown and others is another forum and another space where leaders are coming together to make decisions on behalf of those that can't get in, that can't get accredited, my 5-year-old daughter that can't speak for herself, all of us that are dealing with impacts on the ground in our communities. North Dakota has been, it's been like a killing ground for the fossil fuel industry. I myself am a cancer survivor. I had a stage 4 sarcoma tumor when I was 20. I shouldn't be here. It has a very poor prognosis. A lot of my friends have died. They didn't survive cancer, so now their children are orphans because their mothers were taken away from them. I've suffered miscarriages. I've been through so much, and I blame it on the industry. And here we are going to California, and we're told we can't get into these meetings, and that these meetings are going to talk about emissions trading schemes. And they're not going to talk about keeping it in the ground in the first place, which is common sense. If we want to stop the climate crisis and all of this pollution and toxicity we're putting into our air, water, and soil, we need to stop what we're doing as humanity, which is looking at our system as us being above it. We're a part of the system as humanity. We're not above it. We don't control things. And what they're talking about is controlling the clouds, controlling the weather, controlling everything by the bottom line being money and a carbon market-based system. And so we have to show up. We don't want to leave our children for weeks at a time, but we have to show up in these spaces. We have to make our voices heard and interject. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I'm not one who wants to be on the menu, so I'm going to be at the table and have my voice heard and tell these folks, you know what? We're all in this together as humanity, whether you like it or not. And if that impacts your bottom line, at the end of the day, you can't eat your money. You can't drink that oil. So wake up and understand that us, the community members that are living in our communities that have small-scale gardens, small-scale wind and solar, we have the answers and the solutions and are implementing them. Listen to us and allow us to continue to do these things and stop giving subsidies and credits to the oil industry so they can continue destroying the planet. Matigadads, thank you.
Thank you, Kandi. And welcome to Jacqui Patterson, calling in from Jamaica. Jacqui's with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's Environmental and Climate Justice Program.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Great. Okay. So, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Patterson with the NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program. Just a little bit about why we're a part of this call and conversation, and then a little bit about what we're doing. We are working at the intersection of race and gender and climate, and really looking at particularly how women of color are, the call have stated, women of color and Indigenous women are at double jeopardy in terms of impacts of climate, and yet we are, as Kandi so eloquently stated, not in the decision-making spaces, even solutions. And so the work we're doing is looking at everything from the communities we serve being impacted by disasters, and seeing, and particularly in the South in the United States. So we've seen multiple instances where communities are disproportionately impacted because of vulnerabilities, and particularly communities of color, and then women face double in addition to the gender dynamics of post-disaster situations where there's a spike in violence against women after disasters. We also are working on issues around immigration. As a state, I'm in Jamaica, where my father, I'm from a family of immigration family, and as well as my mom came up to the U.S. came up to Chicago through the Great Migration, quote unquote, from Mississippi. But when we look at women who are immigrating from the U.S., immigrating into the U.S. or immigrating into other nations, and many, because of climate forced migration, women face the threat of violence in those border crossings, often, which are insecure situations. And so women being forced from their homes in the first place is a challenge, but then also women being in situations of vulnerability and being assaulted as a result in border crossings is another issue that we are working on. Kandi talked about the toxic situation, the toxic exposure. So again, with these toxic facilities that drive climate change being disproportionately placed in communities of color and Indigenous communities, it means that it's our communities that are ingesting these toxins and dealing with whether it's the respiratory issues, or for women, there is the issue of endocrine disruptors, which are part of the toxins that come out of these facilities. And then finally, explicitly looking at this issue of underrepresentation of women in governance in other decision-making spaces. And so again, women being most impacted and women of color, but yet least represented in decision-making spaces. And so the work that we're doing is everything from documenting. We started our work with the Women of Color for Climate Justice Road Tour, which is when I first met Kandi, to write what we're doing right now, which is a review of organizations working at the intersection of gender and climate, which I've recently interviewed Osprey for that. And so we're doing another work. Oh, sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. We want to make sure we can get to everybody.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Next, we have Antonia Juhasz from the Uncovering Oil Investigative Reporting Program, a project of the Society of Environmental Journalists. Welcome.
Thank you very much. My name is Antonia Juhasz, and I'm an energy analyst, author, and investigative journalist specializing in oil. As we've heard from other speakers, it's well established that the impacts of climate change and the production and burning of fossil fuels are borne disproportionately on women and children, including to maternal and fetal health. For example, and as Kandi has pointed out, when women ingest fossil fuels directly, such as in the case of oil leaching into food or groundwater, or their byproducts in the form of pollution, it can adversely affect women's ability to get pregnant or maintain a pregnancy to term. The pollutants can also pass from the mother to the fetus, harming its development and the long-term health and well-being of the child. Yet it is these exact stories and impacts that are disproportionately and consistently underreported in the media, including the use of women's expertise, research, analysis, and reporting. My investigative reporting into the oil sector is therefore tended to focus, whenever feasible, on these stories of women and their analyses. This was certainly my approach, for example, in my reporting from Standing Rock, and before that, the fracking in North Dakota, which were largely focused on women, including Kandi, whose story and that of her daughter I featured in my reporting for Newsweek, and later in Pacific Standard magazine My latest investigation, which is just out in print now and will be online September 11th, in which I'll discuss at the Assembly, is a feature article in the September-October issue of Pacific Standard magazine, which was partially born from an interview I did at Standing Rock with LaDonna Brave Bull Allard. She told me that her original inspiration for resisting the Dakota Access Pipeline could be summed up well in one sentence: nobody is going to build an oil pipeline next to my son's grave. The proximity of her son's burial place came immediately to mind when I then learned of the death of another young man, a worker building the Dakota Access Pipeline. I then turned my attention to the pipeline itself, in addition to leaks that might come from it, its disruption to land, spiritual areas, and water, but the pipeline itself as a source of potential direct harm, and investigated the circumstances that led to the young man's death, which then led me to look at the broader working conditions, not just at this pipeline, but in the industry as a whole. I learned that outside of private industry, no one had published fatality rate data for oil and gas pipeline construction workers. So I compiled the data and ran the numbers myself, finding exclusively that oil and gas pipeline construction is among the deadliest jobs in America, and offering a solution that had been offered from the ground itself, supporting water as life, shifting oil and gas pipeline construction workers to the desperately needed work of rebuilding America's pipelines and allowing them to become water protectors as well.
Thank you, Antonia. Let's hear one more time from Osprey Orielle Lake from the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network International. Orielle, any additional thoughts after we've heard everybody speak? And this is before we do our Q&A in a little bit.
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to say thanks to all of the women for taking time to join us to share their knowledge and stories. And this is why we need to hear from women. Our analysis is different. Our framing is different, and it has been missing from the international discourse, which is one of the biggest reasons we're in this crisis. I think the other thing I wanted to mention is that at the event that we'll be having on September 11th at the Women's Assembly for Climate Justice, we are going to be launching and releasing a list of demands, a call to action, that we're going to be handing over to the Global Climate Action Summit leadership. And we're very excited to put forward this document. It will be released on September 11th. And it goes through a lot of the issues that everyone has been speaking about so eloquently. We're going to be talking about the demand for Indigenous rights. Right now, 80% of all the biodiversity left on Earth is in the hands and lands of Indigenous peoples. There's a reason for that. We need to be standing with our Indigenous allies to protect the rights for biodiversity, for the climate, for the water. We'll be talking about promoting gender equity in this document. We'll be talking about the rights of nature, which has a very different framework that allows us to have a different legal structure that respects the rights of Mother Earth, equal to human rights. So we stop treating nature as property. We have to stop seeing Mother Earth as a commodity. It's destroying our Earth and our children's futures. We'll be talking about promoting energy democracy so that everyone has access and that we really move out anymore from taking fossil fuels out of the ground. No new fossil fuel infrastructure is something we must demand from our elected leaders. So we'll be handing out this list of demands, hearing these solutions. We're going to be talking about women in agroecology. We are going to be talking about democracy, environmental racism. We'll be talking about stopping sacrifice zones, the fact that we must stop having Indigenous, brown, and Black bodies on the line, and looking at white supremacy and what are the role of people who are privileged to step into these fights on the front lines. So I think it's going to be a very robust session on September 11th. But most importantly, all of us are coming to gather in San Francisco because we cannot let the current agenda continue. It's not working. We're past 400 parts per million of carbon emissions in the atmosphere. Every year is getting hotter, and front lines are being impacted first and worse, especially women. And this has to stop. And so we have to change the narrative and show our solutions. And we really encourage you, lastly, to look on our website, the WECAN International website. We have a wonderful project called Women Speak, and there's case studies and stories, thousands of them from women all over the world, showing community-led solutions, showing the way. You can look on our website and find Women Speak. We have the Women's Climate Action Agenda, showing all the statistics about why women's leadership is central at this time, and particularly lifting up women of color and Indigenous women Those are the voices we need to listen to the most. Thanks.
Thank you, Osprey, and thank you to all of our speakers. Now let's take some questions from the reporters who've joined us. I see that several of you are on the call. Feel free to unmute and ask a question or send something in the chat bar. You'll see that to the right. But to start off, I'd like to ask our speakers the following question. How do you see the role of women in the climate change movement and in your own work? So how do you see the role of women in the movement and your own work? You can respond just by raising your hand or jumping in, and if we're able to get another couple of questions from reporters, let's go for it, and I welcome your responses.
Well, this is Kandi. I would jump in there and just say that for us specifically as Native American women, we've seen a lot of change over the past 500 years since the beginning of, colonization happening here in the United States, which has predominantly taken away of the role of our men, being warrior status and what we were supposed to do. A lot of times what we've seen is women taking back our power as the leaders we always were, albeit more behind the scenes, and really finding our space to help our men move forward and to say that enough is enough. We're tired of seeing our children dying. And so it is, I work with the Indigenous Environments Network, and I've predominantly seen women leadership all across the board as directors, leaders of grassroots movements. And I think it's because we don't have a choice. We don't want to feel powerless anymore while our kids are sick, while they're having RSV and asthmas and problems breathing. And so it's like, that's our role, is to protect the future generations.
Hey, this is Eriel Deranger. I've turned off my camera just because I'm doing something right now, but I want to add to Kandi's remarks because it hits the nail right on the head. Colonialism really robbed our women of the power in our communities. And when we talk about climate stabilization and addressing the climate crisis, we have to really think about not just stabilizing the climate, but restabilizing the power dynamics of men and women. I had an elder say to me one time when we were talking about climate change, and I asked about the role of women, and she said, when you look at it like this, you look at the fact that we can't be talking about stabilizing the climate and addressing the crisis if we're not able to stabilize the balance between ourselves and our relationship with Mother Earth, and stabilize the relationship between the masculine and the feminine. And that we have to challenge the roles of patriarch in our communities and in our societies in order for us to find the effective mechanisms to address the crisis. And that comes from our cultural teachings and understandings of the role of women. And it's so powerful when we start to think about this in a much bigger picture when we're talking about addressing the climate.
Thank you, Eriel and Kandi. Anyone else like to jump in?
Hi, this is Thilmeeza. I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand, but what I wanted to point out is that corruption and total disregard to the environment go hand in hand with sexism and misogyny, which we are actually seeing in the current regime in the Maldives, and which you're also seeing in this country here in the US. I've written a long article about that, an op-ed about that not too long ago, a couple of months ago, how corruption and sexism go hand in hand in my country and how it has played out. So I think we cannot have a country that is prosperous and peaceful and sustainable without including women, half of the population, and we cannot achieve that inclusion without achieving gender equality and have respect to the fundamental human rights, women's rights. So we cannot achieve gender equality without restoring rule of law, ending corruption, and bringing back democracy and good governance. And it is people who has to demand for these things.
Thank you. Let's talk about outcomes. It's always helpful to get into the specifics. So women, what outcomes would you like to see at the GCAS? And how are those outcomes tied to the most important issues, to your most important issues? Antonia, why don't you jump in?
Great, thanks. I was trying to give everyone else the opportunity to speak first. I think there's a whole host of critical demands. I think one of the most important is that Kandi mentioned earlier, which is the very obvious and long-held solution of the necessity of keeping fossil fuels in the ground as a starting point. Going through these impacts that Kandi so passionately discussed and everyone else has brought up, of the disproportionate impacts on women and children, we're talking about survival. So as Kandi said, I have spent a lot of time immersed in oil as I've done my writing, my reporting, and I'm confident that a miscarriage that I suffered was a result of that exposure as well. I think many women have that similar experience, and that is a story about basic survival of our species and disproportionate impacts borne obviously by women who have to live day in and day out at the sources of production, exploration, transport, refining, disposal of fossil fuels, and the burning of fossil fuels compound other issues of inequality and discrimination and injustice. And the basic starting block of keeping those modes of destruction of fossil fuels in the ground is something that we've known is a necessity for decades. I mean, the research that's come out looking at ExxonMobil's knowledge and scientific investigations into climate change has been fairly astounding. One piece of which was that in the early 70s, an intern at ExxonMobil came to the conclusion that 80% of fossil fuels would need to stay in the ground to avert the worst climate crisis. It then took us 40 years to get to that same place with the ICC at the United Nations saying the same thing, that 80% at a minimum of fossil fuels would need to stay in the ground to avert the worst climate crisis, where we already know that we're there. And that's not just about averting climate crisis, it's about averting the economic impacts, the justice impacts, the health impacts, the ability to live a healthy life every single day all across society. And that is something that women have known and have been demanding for a long time, and women have known and demanded the solutions as well for a long time, and what can be done at the local level, because that's been out of necessity, how to survive within your own household, how to survive within your own community to live healthier, more sustainable lives. And so that's a question of listening to the solutions that have already been proffered and listening to the voices of women who have laid out these solutions. It's not a question of new technology that's needed. It's a question of redirecting our listening power and our resources to those who already have the solutions. And it's a question of embracing a very basic starting point. And in California, there couldn't be a better place to start this, because we are an economy that is wealthy, has lots of other alternatives to producing oil, and can shift away from fossil fuels without great consequence. And therefore, Governor Brown, who's taken a stand as someone who really wants to be perceived as a leader on climate change, could take a step as being the first head of a large fossil fuel economy to say we're going to start the process of implementing policies that keep fossil fuels in the ground.
Can I just add that I'm not really confident about the outcomes of the actual GCAS itself, the Global Climate Action Summit. I am, however, confident about the Soul to Soul Week that we've been planning, and really excited that it's getting underway on Friday, tomorrow, and leading up through the GCAS. And I hope that people will be there. We're the on-the-ground grassroots, the real people that are dealing with the climate crisis, and those are where I'm confident a lot of the solutions are going to come out.
Can I add some?
Jacqui, are you there?
Is that Thilmeeza? Was that you?
Yes.
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think, yes, one of the key demands should be no new oil plant should ever be fired anymore. We should keep it in ground. That should be like the foremost and the most important. And the second thing is we should definitely move towards 100% decarbonization trajectory to reach by 2050, because without which we cannot ensure survival of the most vulnerable communities, including small island states like my own. And it is really absurd and ridiculous to even entertain the idea that we cannot be on such a pathway where it is okay to decarbonize at a rate at which only certain groups of people would be saved and only certain lives matter. So I think it's important to keep that on top of our agenda and keep pushing and demanding for that.
Thank you, Thilmeeza. Jacqui, did you have a comment? Or Eriel, or Osprey?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute.
No, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so similarly, I would definitely say that outcomes are not necessarily going to take place in the walls of the Moscone Center, but the multiple, starting with Soul to Soul, but then also other gatherings that are happening. So just literally the coming together of groups to talk about solutions, groups that are on the front lines of these challenges. So I've seen whether there's a group on displacement that's coming together and having conversations. We're putting together a group of African descendant folks to talk about how we're going to have a global agenda around this being the UN decade of people of African descent. So that's where I see the solutions coming out. Thank you.
Hi, this is Eriel. I just want to also add that, you know, a lot of the it isn't going to happen within the walls of the GCAS Center. It's not going to happen within the IPCC. It's going to happen continually from the outside and the outside pressures of communities, not just at these, you know, key events, but it has to be sustained throughout the year, and that this fight goes beyond the GCAS, it goes beyond the UNFCCC meetings. And it's necessary that our communities are given the agency to have a place in the decision-making processes at all levels, not just at these key critical moments, but at all levels. Because if we're only standing up in these key moments where we're not going to have the type of strength of our movements. And so that we have to remember that we have to continue to take this movement forward every single day in all of our communities to ensure the rights of women and the rights of Indigenous communities are included in all levels of decision-making processes, so that when we get to these points in meetings like this, that we have these formed, sustained demands like we're bringing together. And that's the beautiful thing around events like Soul to Soul, global, like GGJ and WECAN, is that these are movements that live beyond these sort of pivotal, critical meetings like the GCAS. And I just want to thank everyone for all their beautiful efforts, because it's the sustained efforts of everyone on this call that makes this movement so powerful.
And yeah, I agree with, thank you everyone for your really good words on this. And I think one of the things that happens at these moments, like when the people's movements, the climate justice movements go to the UN conferences, go to world forums such as we're having in San Francisco next week, it's a moment where we can visibilize very clearly to elected officials what we've been doing, as Eriel has stated so well, all along. This is what we're doing. People are on the front lines. These are life and death situations for many people. People in the movements are working very, very hard to demonstrate alternative solutions to the business as usual solutions that have taken us down this road we're on. And I think that's what's very important about the outcome at GCAS. Every time we have an opportunity for these clashes, if you will, of ideologies, it's an opportunity for us to say, with, you know, truly, I say this with love in our hearts, care for other people's children as well, care for everyone, that we cannot continue with these market-based systems that have brought us into this crisis. The fact of the rule of corporations, the fact of corporations having rights, all of these financial instruments have really put us into such a dangerous position where 1%, people who have enormous wealth, people are exercising enormous greed, who are very disconnected from nature, are very disconnected from the front lines, continue to make the decisions for people who are being impacted. And I think one of the most important things that happens when we have events like the Women's Assembly, Soul to Soul, people on the streets, because there's going to be a huge march on September 8th, let's not forget that we have the opportunity to have the voices that need to be heard out front And that's what we need to do, is change the narrative and really demonstrate that there is a different world based on different systems in which people and planet come before profit. And that's a big message that we have to make very clear this week.
Thank you, Osprey. In the time remaining, we know that some of the reporters who cover these issues are business reporters or legal reporters and are working at one level, but we also have reporters who cover the public interest, well, you know who those outlets are. So how do we communicate to those audiences? So I'd like to ask you, our speakers, what should those reporters tell their listeners, their viewers, their readers? How can you help them communicate these issues to families, right, to people who are maybe just starting out, who are not yet fatigued? So what would you, on your wish list, what would you have them say?
Well, this is Kandi, and I prefer to speak to reporters that report to Business Insight and to report on, the people that are looking at stocks and bonds and markets and stuff, because they're the ones that need to hear it the most. And it's not an us and them situation, and it's also not a business as usual situation. It should never be about supply and demand, because if it were, our demands aren't being heard. I've had people say to me, well, when you went to the protest at Standing Rock, how did you get there? Did you get there by filling your gas tank with unicorn farts? And I started laughing with the things that they come up with. And I said, no, I drove my hybrid, which, by the way, was very expensive for me, and I had to pay over a number of years to afford. Would I love to drive a 100% electric-powered vehicle? Yeah, where is it? Why isn't this country being made, those options being made available to us? I am demanding this. Where's my supply? And so there's a very real situation we're here about changing the narrative and changing the story from what we're told consistently on the TV and being bombarded with as consumers. This is a consumeristic market, and that is a part of the problem. We also have to remember that it's not just climate being over there all by itself. This ties in with transportation systems, this ties in with food systems, this ties in with all the stuff that's coming out around Monsanto right now, and how your oatmeal that you thought was good for you in the morning is actually poisoned. We, again, have to look at the system as a whole and wake up and realize and understand that's how we're impacting each other through the entire way that the system is operated. And then take a step back as an individual and say, well, this is what I can do. I can work to decrease my carbon footprint, yes, but I need the help of those industries who keep telling me, turn your water off when you brush your teeth in the morning, yet they are poisoning billions of gallons a minute in their processes. Stop putting the onus on us and put some of that back on the industry where the blame belongs.
Hi.
We can hear you.
Yeah, so I just wanted to echo what Kandi just said. It's really true, and it's a really important narrative. We have to take the narrative of individual apathy is the greatest threat to climate change away from the messages that are in the mass media. The corporations put the responsibility on individuals, saying that it is our apathy that is actually the problem, which is totally not true. It is the corporations and the industries that are causing these problems, as well as if we don't, as a common person, have access to comprehensive public transport, or if we don't have access to or option to buy green items or hybrid cars, or when we go shopping, if the plastic bags is the only option that is given, plastic cups are the only things that are available, then that's what public's going to use. So we have to change the narrative. It's us taking our coffee mug every day when we go to the coffee shop is not the solution. They shouldn't be serving in plastic cups to begin with. So those narratives, I think, needs to be changed, and it's important to change that narrative to say individual apathy is not the greatest threat to climate change.
Fantastic, thank you. And I feel like we could do this for another 5 hours, but we do want to respect your time and the time for our other people on the call. So in closing, on behalf of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, I'd like to thank all of our speakers for your time and expertise. These women are available for follow-up questions and can go much deeper into their analysis of this problem. I will be sending out a transcript of today's press conference to reporters, and we do hope you'll join us on September 11th in San Francisco at the Women's Assembly for Climate Justice, Women Leading Solutions on the Front Lines of Climate Change. Thank you in advance for your coverage of this important issue and sharing these women's stories.
Thank you, everyone.